For this video, I thought it would be a great idea to highlight some of the things I did behind the scenes in order to make this animation. With that said, let's get started. So, the script. Turns out, I didn't even initially make a script for this animation even though it ended up being 5 minutes long. As you would expect, this resulted in me having to go back and fix literally every single problem that I caused because of that. But after a few changes, we can now move on to the next part. That of course is Blender, where most of the heavy lifting was actually done for this animation. Just like my other animations, it's important to make sure where it's going to take place and what Pokemon are going to be in the animation. We have our setting here, which is just a simple cave with a lot of crystals scattered across, with the crystals having an animated texture as well. With the setting established, this now brings us to the models, Terapagos and Necrozma of course, but we also have to include the alternate forms that they both have, bringing the total model count to 7. Which means I have to animate all 7 of these models within the same file. Yeah, that's gonna be fun. So, animation. I'm just going to give a very quick and basic explanation on how animation works in Blender, just so everything I talk about afterwards actually makes some amount of sense. And I'll be using Hydreigon here as an example. So first I'm going to keyframe all of the bones that Hydreigon has, but I'm gonna stop right here and explain what a keyframe is very quickly. Keyframes in Blender record data or a value that is input for almost anything, like location, rotation, scale, and even emission. Wait, no, not emission!
Throwing flashbang!
The point is, keyframes allow you to control a lot of different properties which can be used to create some interesting effects that I will mention later in the video. But for now, I'll focus strictly on the animation of the model's movement itself. Let's start with Terapagos, since across all 3 forms there wasn't too much to animate, but there are a few things I would like to point out. For base form Terapagos, it's only slightly more mobile than its frisbee forms, which isn't much since it's still a turtle after all. This part right here is actually pretty simple. All I do is animate the legs, tail, head, eyelids, and even the earrings to really exaggerate the landing after awakening. I didn't really do too much for the terrestrialized version. I kind of just animated the eyelids blinking and kind of called it a day, since it's a floating disc, like there's not much I can do with that. It's pretty much the same story for the stellar form. I didn't really have to animate too much, it's not very mobile, except I did animate the Terrajewel spinning around it. So yeah, for Terapagos, animation wasn't too complicated, but Necrozma is where things get tricky. Unlike Terapagos, Necrozma appears in 4 different forms, with each one requiring a different approach. Now I won't go over every single little thing I did for each one because this video will be far too long. However, I will include a few notable parts that I felt stood out from my experience with animating these models. Starting with base form Necrozma, its biggest problem was that it doesn't have a neck. No, really, it doesn't have a neck. To be more specific, because its head and body is one object, it physically cannot look down. This meant that I had to find a way around this, and of course I did. What I ended up doing was, after the camera moved to the right, I had the camera turn towards the ceiling, then tilt downwards towards Necrozma, just to make it appear that Necrozma was looking downwards. Was that long-winded explanation confusing or what? Because that camera was easier for me to set up than explain that entire process just now. As for the rest of Necrozma's animations, they were all actually pretty simple. Just mostly a bunch of arm movements for the prismatic laser and punching. So yeah, nothing out of the ordinary here. Now with that done, we could talk a bit about the Duskmane form. Looking at the Duskmane form, since it is just Solgaleo with DLC attached, I just referenced an ordinary lion but made some of the movements less realistic, since it is still a Pokemon at the end of the day. I wanted Duskmane's movements to be dynamic, with things like jumping into the air and leaping off the crystal from the ceiling, which I will admit wasn't planned at first. But I like how it came out, especially with the camera movement before resting at this position. When it came to claw animations, I did a few things like having them sway back and forth at this part, also having them settle here after Duskmane slides backwards. But the most important part was making the claw attacks look really violent by shifting the camera onto the claws whenever they were lifted. But yeah, that's all for the Duskmane form for now. Next up is Lunala, also with DLC, or Dawnwing's Necrozma. As you would imagine, most of the animations were, well, about the wings. Beyond that, I did reference a few things from the game, like how Lunala shifts its wings into a circular moon shape when charging and firing the Moongeist beam. For the multiple slashes, all I did was have Dawnwing start at one side of the cave off camera, then dash on camera towards the other side and setting its location to where it would come from next, repeating that whole process for 4 times. Oh yeah, and about the clap, don't ask about that. I wasn't really sure how to transition into Ultra Necrozma, so yeah, that's just gonna be there. For Ultra Necrozma, the initial movements after the light shrinks was made in reference to this in-game cutscene. Overall, most of Ultra Necrozma's animations weren't too complex, with just some wing movements and changing it to different poses for charging light that burns the sky. Okay, that attack name is way too long to say, I will just say Z move from now on. Once I set up the charging pose for the Z move, I then had it shift its body when firing the Z move to exaggerate the effort of using the attack. Finally, here towards the end, I just had to animate Ultra Necrozma being hit by the Terra Starstorm, which I will admit could have done a better job in selling the hits, but that is a lesson learned for next time. Now, with most of the movements explained for all 7 models, we can now move to the part that more or less carried the animation, that being VFX. Okay, VFX, which was part of the reason why it took me over 2 months to upload this animation. This was because of 1, my inexperience in creating VFX besides a few small scale things in the Hisui and Samurai animation, but 2, I needed to be realistic for how good the VFX would come out, specifically the attack animations, since trying to do too much would just be adding more while gaining less, if that makes any sense. Regardless of these concerns, I still wanted to create something that I could be content with at the time. With that monologue out of the way, I'll now go over some of the VFX I created for the animation. Up first is Necrozma's signature move, Prismatic Laser. Now I went with a different path on this attack. Instead of it being multiple beams firing like in the game, I came up with a simple singular long form beam with the more defined rainbow coloring as the material, alongside light rays and bright particles to represent the charging before the beam is fired, to give some build up and anticipation for the attack. The particles for this effect was made through a particle emitter. To be more specific, almost any object can act as a particle emitter, since all it takes is to just choose any other object as your particle, and that is what will be generated. But I brought this up because throughout the animation, I used particle emitters a lot to add a little more detail to certain scenes, especially to attacks like Sunsteel Strike and Moongeist Beam. Coming back to Prismatic Laser, how I made the actual base of the laser itself was just through a curve, which through animating geometry on the curve, I can make a beam-like shape instead of just using a plain cylinder. Please! I beg you! Then for the frontal view of the prismatic laser, I just keyframed the scale of the beam to expand, basically giving the appearance that it was enveloping the entire area. Then we finished it off with a violent explosion, which was made through deforming a white sphere with a modifier, giving it an edgy and noisy form. I also did the same thing again, but with the smoke version. This allowed me to combine the 2 parts to produce a very chaotic effect, which I personally think led to a good result overall. Now, with the gist of Prismatic Laser done, Sunsteel Strike is up next. For Sunsteel Strike, I had to do things differently this time around because of the nature of the attack, as it is just Duskmane ramming its body into its opponent, this specific case being the Terapagos shield. Instead of trying to match the effect's position to where Duskmane was in the 3D space using keyframes, I decided to apply a child of constraint to the effect so that it followed the main body's movement and position, making it easier for me to animate. Moving on to the actual effect itself, I went with the cone that I rearranged a bit to look almost like a drill, weirdly enough, but the part that brings it together is the shading, of course. All I did was just mess around with a few shader nodes to get this fiery-ish effect to replicate the burning of the original Sunsteel Strike. But yeah, that's about it. I just made a particle emitter that created sparks so that it better showed the continuous impact against the shield, some wind type of effect, and of course another explosion at the end, because why not? If there was a pattern to follow in this video, then you'll know that Moongeist Beam is next, and with that, do you remember what I said about not using a cylinder for a beam? Please! I beg you! Well, I used one here, and the reason why I did is because I couldn't get the electric effect to work, so I just made both objects a cylinder. For the star particles here, they actually have the color keyframe to change from a light blue to dark blue, matching the color of the Moongeist Beam. These other effects consisted of mostly spherical and star-shaped objects that are animated by messing with the scale of those objects. The endpoint of the beam has a few shapes changed with the deform modifier, like a star, sphere, and cylinder for these flared up parts. Finally, you know there has to be another explosion, which was just made through cutting a sphere in half and animating the scale to grow it from 0. For the Z move, of course, gotta stay with the basic sphere shape with the green electric effect, which was made through shader nodes. For the explosion, I animated the sphere being stretched out so that it would spread around on collision, then having a mushroom-shaped cloud move upwards to finish off the explosion. Now, as for Terra Starstorm, I first tried to make something similar to the in-game one, but I didn't really get anything to work well. I then remembered the Gen 5 Draco meteor where the sky is transformed into a starry one for a second, then the meteors come crashing down. So that's what I did. I started with the colorful space background, which honestly now it might have been a bit much with the colors. As for the comet itself, it was just a sphere stretched out with some explosions added at the point of impact for each comet. And yes, I did put 18 comets total into the attack for each Terra Jewel. The explosion at the end was again very basic, with just a sphere that was animated using a displace modifier with a rainbow color. And that's it for the VFX, well, main ones that is. Of course, I did include some other small details in the animation, but again, video would take too long. Besides that, I just took the file, put it in Resolve, edited the animation with some camera shakes and other visuals, put in sound effects where it was necessary, and added music that I felt worked the best for each part of the animation. And that's really it, for real this time. And with that, thank you for watching.